It has been a year since Robert Mugabe resigned as Zimbabwe's president, ending his 37-year rule over the southern African country. President Mugabe was the only leader of Zimbabwe and had known since independence from Britain. While the West regarded the 94-year-old as an autocrat, some in Africa saw him as an anti-colonial champion. However, Zimbabwe's ravaged economy and high unemployment echo Mugabe's spotted legacy of leadership. CGTN's Beryl Ooro brings us that story.
Educated and obeying, Mugabe came to power after 7 years of a liberation bush war. But nearly 4 decades after independence in 1980, many saw him as power-obsessed in the relentless pursuit of control.
There will never be a regime change here. There will always be the people of Zimbabwe in control.
The farm seizures and a collapse in agricultural foreign exchange earnings unleashed hyperinflation. The economy shrunk by more than a third from 2000 to 2008, sending unemployment rates above 80%. Unapologetic Mugabe portrayed himself as a radical African nationalist, competing against racist and imperialist forces in Washington and London.
The Western countries, in particular the United States and the European Union, who imposed illegal sanctions against Zimbabwe, have, to our surprise and that of SADC and the rest of Africa, refused to remove those sanctions. If they will not assist the inclusive government in rehabilitating our economy, could they please stop their filthy, clandestine, divisive antics?
After 4 decades, on November 14, 2017, Mugabe's grasp on Zimbabwe was weakened when the army seized power.
Firstly, we wish to assure the nation that His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and Commander-in-Chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, Comrade R.G. Mugabe, and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed.
The week before, Mugabe sacked his Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, ZANU-PF's favorite, to succeed him.
The Congress is due in a few weeks from now. I will preside over its processes, which must not be prepossessed by any acts calculated to undermine it or to compromise the outcomes in the eyes of the public.
Days later, in the public eye, Parliament began impeachment proceeding against the then 93-year-old leader after the ruling ZANU-PF fired him as its leader. He signed a short letter of resignation to Parliament Speaker Jacob Mudenda that was read out to lawmakers on November the 21st. Wild celebrations broke out in Parliament and among the public in the capital, Harare. Dancing and cheering after Robert Mugabe's announcement of resignation. Beryl Ooro, CGTN.
And to discuss Zimbabwe's progress 1 year on, I'm joined by Gideon Chitanga. He's a political analyst from the Center of the Study of Democracy in Johannesburg in South Africa. Gideon, thank you for joining us on Africa Live. 1 year after Mugabe, has much really changed, or has there been no change at all? We keep hearing about matters of economic decline.
Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to speak to you. Look, I think that Zimbabwe was left by the former president in a very deep economic crisis. And we have to understand the context and the roots of it all. So I'm just referring to it to express the view that I do not think that there was going to be a quick fix and a quick kind of a economic turnaround in Zimbabwe. We hear great intentions from President Mnangagwa but the movement and the impact on the ordinary people is still very slow. So the ordinary person in the streets doesn't really relate and feel that there is a beneficial economic movement or transformation or change. But in terms of the enunciated policies and the rhetoric coming from the government, I think there's clarity on the intentions. So there's a gap between the expectations on the ground and what the government continues to say as an indication of its intentions and the direction the country is going towards.
Let's look at those reforms that you've mentioned, because as you've just said as well, there is no quick fix to Zimbabwe's economic decline. President Mnangagwa has been pushing reforms that will usher an economic revival, but why does he seem not to be making any headway?
Yes, so one obvious reason is that President Mnangagwa is part of the former system, and he hasn't attracted as much practical goodwill because there is deep-seated skepticism that the government of Zimbabwe is sincere, is committed. There hasn't been such a break in terms of its conduct and culture, and I mean a visible break that could be convincing to the key players. I think Western donor countries are still looking at the new government with a lot of skepticism. They listen to the rhetoric coming from the government and think that Mugabe was the best rhetorician that came from Zimbabwe. And, you know, maybe President Mnangagwa is still making the same promises, which are very impressive. I think the judgment should be based on the action, and the action is not forthcoming. The second thing is that Zimbabwe hasn't had any multilateral or bilateral support for 2 decades, since the 2000s. And it is a country that has to stand on its own, yet it has nothing. It's economically empty in terms of the resources that are needed to reboot the economy. And I think in terms of the ideas, there is a need for a lot of new thinking in the different structures of government in the country as well.
To overcome that deep-seated skepticism that you have just mentioned, let's look at an inclusive political system here, because Zimbabwe held elections, but there was a dispute over the outcome. Would an all-inclusive government be an option for the country, perhaps to overcome that deep-seated skepticism that you talk about?
Actually, what I think is, so the government is trying to come up with an economic program. And I think the thinking within government is that a reformed economic program can attract donors and the international community to come to the table and support it. But my thinking is that the missing aspect in the whole reform process is the idea that ZANU-PF is of the view that they can neglect the social and the political aspects of this reform program and solely focus on the economic issues. And I think that will not work. I would have thought that the government needed to come up with a comprehensive program that inclusively and simultaneously deals with both the social political issues and the economic reform program. So the most immediate thing that comes to my mind is that Zimbabwe is a broken society, is a divided society, has had a very painful conflictual history. So one aspect that I would have advised the government to go for is basically addressing the historical pains, the conflicts, and bring that together with an economic program so that you are seen to move the country in a manner that impacts the ordinary people and the citizens.
Right.
Unfortunately, the trickle-down approach, the model of economics that the government is applying, does not have an immediate impact on the ordinary person. What is likely to happen is that a lot of the ordinary people are going to resist the costs of the economic reforms because they don't feel that they are part of them. A part of the process that triggered the emergence of the opposition in Zimbabwe was the economic structural adjustment programs, which were informed by the same logic which the new dispensation is actually going back to. If you go back to the same logic and the same policies and the same processes, in a country that is
Okay.
already broken to the extent that Zimbabwe is now, without buying in the population, you simply create more conflict, I think.
All right, Gideon Chitanga, political analyst, joining us there from Johannesburg. Thank you.